The following program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.
Every day, citizens around the country are faced with new dilemmas that affect them profoundly. Whether it's injustice, discrimination, falling through the cracks, scandals and cronyism, balances of power, ethics, religious freedoms, state versus citizens, and unfunded mandates, and the list goes on and on and on. Welcome to Speak Up. It's directed at those who have fallen through the cracks, and it gives them a voice. It's your turn to speak up, to stand up and fight back.
Welcome to this episode of Speak Up. This is our first Skype interview that we've had, and we want to thank our guest, who is a licensed marriage family relations therapist, speaker, and published author, member of the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, Linda J. Gottlieb. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Did I pronounce your name right?
Yeah, Gottlieb. Right.
Gottlieb. And you're also a licensed clinical social worker?
Yes, with R privileges, which means I can diagnose from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, just like psychiatrists do. It's a very important ability.
Now, reading through one of your amicus briefs that I happened to stumble upon through one of our people that are friendly to Speak Up, they've actually been on the show, Ed Bryans. He forwarded it to me, and I read through it, and you have a really impressive background. You've been doing this for about 43 years. 43
years. I started out working with a foster care population, and where I was a psychiatric social worker. I ended that career as assistant director of foster care and adoption for Nassau County, New York, and then I went into private practice as a family therapist.
And what was the genesis for the amicus brief? Where did that come from?
Well, I collaborate with a lot of attorneys as an expert witness testifying in New York, and a lot of attorneys and lawyers for the child had no idea what the background is on alienation, which is what we're talking about here, the active process by one parent turning a child against the other parent. It's such a common, unfortunate, dysfunctional behavior that it happens to some degree in 80% of all cases. So I just felt that I had to do something to help people address this issue. And I'm very happy to say that on my website, I've had lawyers as well as parents contact me and submit my briefs around the country and even in Canada.
Yeah. Now, one of my first questions is to define PAS, and that's basically what you just did, really.
Parental alienation, and I've dropped the word syndrome for a couple of reasons. I don't want to get hung up on a controversial battle over labels, which a lot of people do for various reasons. So I call it parental alienation or estrangement or crappy parenting. It's the process of turning a child against a fit parent to the point where the child has to fight their strong instincts to love a parent in order to please one parent, and they reject the other parent who has done nothing to deserve that rejection, who has a long loving history with the child.
How do you diagnose this, though? How can you determine whether one parent is actually looking out for the best interest of the other, and it's not there's a legitimate reason? How do you diagnose that?
Well, that's the first thing you look for. Is there a history of abuse and neglect prior to the parents separating?
Right.
And in all these cases, there is never a history. This is a record of a loving, involved parent. So the antenna must go up when all of a sudden, after the filing for a divorce, all of a sudden you get these false allegations of child abuse or domestic violence. And then if you ask the children, why do you hate your parent, especially since I've seen pictures and videos of a loving interaction prior to the separation, and you get these spurious rationalizations. And I've had two teenagers tell me with a straight face, we hated the trip our father took us on to Hawaii. And when I looked incredulous, they said, well, the trip to Cancun, Mexico was a bust. I mean, I've had a 12-year-old girl say, I don't want to see my mother again because her hairstyle is out of the 50s. None of my friends' mothers dress that way. I mean, it is so absurd. Then you'll have 5-year-olds talking in a manner that it's called borrowed scenarios. It's a language they can't understand. Like a 5-year-old will say, well, my father isn't a good role model for my older brother. Well, what does that mean? I don't know, but my mother said that. Well, I had one 7-year-old say, my father used to beat me. And when he couldn't cite any examples, I would say, well, what makes you think where does this come from? You can't even cite one example. And he said, well, I know he must have beat me because my mom said he did. Now, they don't always reveal the source, but when it doesn't compute, and the biggest reason that the cognitive dissonance arose for me with this population is I compared them to the foster care population, which was truly abused and neglected. Right. And they all still craved a relationship with their parents. And their two most asked questions were, when can I go home and when is my next visit? They never said anything negative about their parents. They usually defended their parents, denied any abuse. So it didn't make sense that children from a supposed healthy family all of a sudden develop this animosity. And the only explanation is a brainwashing by the other parent or the other parent's relatives. Sometimes it's grandparents.
Interesting. I just got a call today from the Center for Redress that we opened up. And this individual said that, her husband, they got divorced. Her husband now is being alienated from his son, and the ex-wife accused him of sexual molestation. Mm-hmm. Well, he went through one court order psychologist up to 4, and he passed with flying colors. The courts hired another psychologist, and which he got very defensive with, and they put in a sealed envelope to their finding, and of course the court took that testimony above the other 4. Is this common practice?
It's a very common practice, and it's very unfortunate, and it's actually reprehensible. It's like the court had made up their mind in advance what they were going to decide, and they kept searching until they found the hired gun who was willing to do that. And these allegations of child abuse, particularly sex abuse, it's such a common alienating maneuver and so effective because whenever it happens, the visits are always suspended. If right. It's not by the court, it's Child Protective Services.
Right.
Now, contact between the child and the targeted parent is the greatest antidote to the alienation. So now you have a situation where there's no antidote. The alienating parent tells the child, you see, your mother or your father forgot about you or abandoned you. They don't say the parent was prevented from seeing the child. So it's a snowball effect, and the damage is terrible. Now, what's even worse, in those cases where CPS says resume visits, there are absolutely no grounds to the allegations. Now, all of a sudden, oh, I'm afraid. Now the child's afraid because of all the brainwashing. And now they say, let's go slowly, reinstating contact. That's the worst thing to do.
Right.
Why aren't you removing the child from the person perpetuating abuse? This is psychological abuse of a child, and it is now called that in the DSM-5.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. When parents are separated from their children, there's a laundry list of side effects that come along with that. In reading your brief, I think there was something about sex, real sex offenders, children who've been raped or actually really abused, have a better chance of surviving than children who have been not abandoned, but separated from their parents unlawfully.
Actually, that has been the findings of my colleague here. And yes, children who are subject to abuse by a stranger, actually do better than children who are abused by a relative, because it goes to the basic issue of trust.
Right.
If your own parent violates this basic trust, you just don't develop trust with anybody else. If a stranger does it, it's still a horrendous experience. I don't want to minimize that. But you don't have the same trust issues. It's not a parent violating a child. The trust with both parents is the foundation to all healthy development. Without that, the child is going to be damaged probably for life.
Are you familiar with the guardian ad litems and the people that provide, the mediation for the children? Are you familiar with how that works?
There are a number of roles. There are the gals, the guardian ad litems. Then there's the lawyer for the child. Now, the guardian ad litems have the flexibility of advocating for the child's best interests. Very important, because if they can be educated about alienation and they realize that that's what's going on, they can say to the court, the best interest of the child is not to be with the alienator, even though the child says, I want to be there. Now, the lawyer for the child, which most states have, is absolutely horrendous. It's as if a minor can enter into a contract with their attorney, because the lawyer must represent their best wishes as if the child was an adult contracting for those lawyer services. It is one of the most convoluted developments I have ever seen, very destructive. The hands of the lawyer for the child now is tied. What I have tried to do, and one of the reasons I wrote my amicus brief that alienation is child abuse, is because that is the one escape hatch for the lawyer for the child. If the child's wishes will put them in danger, that's the escape hatch where the lawyer for the child does not have to advocate for their wishes. Has not happened yet. The lawyers are still very much afraid because they may get sued, and they really have to have a therapist backing them up on solid ground, willing to go to the end with them and say, yes, this is emotional child abuse. I stand by the position of the lawyer for the child in advocating removal from the alienator. But again, unfortunately, not many therapists are aware of this dynamic either, because most of my profession is not trained as a family therapist.
Are you familiar with some of the abuses with the guardian ad litems? Are you finding that, for instance, in New Hampshire, there is a rule that for each case that the guardian ad litem is allowed up to $1,000 per case?
Mm-hmm.
They ask for extension over and over and over again, and I believe even in the Vandenberg case, they got an extension for services up to $40,000.
Well, in New York, we don't have guardian ad litems in custody cases. The GALs deal with the PINS petitions and juvenile delinquency. So I only deal with the lawyer for the child in New York, so I wouldn't have much knowledge about that.
You state in your book that the family therapy must be the treatment of choice for PAS, or parental alienation syndrome. In fact, you state that the individual therapy is ineffective and often perpetuates alienation. Can you explain this a little bit?
That is correct. When in individual treatment approaches, the child talks to the therapist. Now, what is a child going to report? First of all, client self-reporting, even by adults, is very subjective. We all know that. We all say, well, there's his story, her story, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. Now you take the immature cognitive development of a child, their inaccuracy is compounded. Now, throw in the brainwashing by the alienating parent, the child is just going to become the puppet of the ventriloquist alienating parent. Unfortunately, most of my profession, except for family therapists in general, treat the child as if they were conceived of the Immaculate Conception.
Right.
They never reach out to the other parent and say, let me hear your side. Well, it's an incomplete picture, and it's like listening to one side of a debate and saying, I'm going to vote for that side. Who would do that? What rational person would do that? But it does happen in therapy, by and large. So now the therapist, who probably went into this business to be helpful, believes the child, believes that the other parent is an abuser, and wants to rescue the child from this alleged abusive, targeted parent. And they write letters, child should not see that parent, child is terrified of that parent. They never go where a family therapist would dare to go and say, well, tell me what your fear is about. Because usually you'll get, I don't know, well, my mom said he's scary,
Right.
or my dad said he's scared.
Or he doesn't let me play Xbox or something to that effect.
Yeah.
One parent is a little stricter
But a
than the other.
family, you know, when we look at alienation, this is a family dynamic. It involves three people. Right. The alienating parent, the targeted parent, and the child. It's a triangle. How do you fix how do you fix the child by pulling the child out of the triangle? You can't. And actually, the psychiatrists who founded the family therapy movement in the 1950s were actually the first to observe this dynamic. They observed the dynamic on the psychiatric ward. This is a crazy-making situation, a double bind, because the child can't have two parents. Either the child accepts the seduction by the alienating parent to join a coalition to reject the other parent, or if they're refused, then the alienating parent would reject them. So it's a catch-22. That's what's crazy making, and that's why in the worst cases, these kids become psychotic. I don't know of anything worse than that.
Speaking of cases, is it usually one-sided? Is it usually the mother or the father that does the parent, the alienating, or?
No, even Richard Gardner, who first I labeled this dynamic in 1985, obviously was not the first to have observed it, as I just stated, going
Right.
back to the 1950s. He first gave it a label. He did initially think it was mostly the mother. And most people initially thought that too. Our thinking is totally revised. All the research now shows, and even Gardner before his death in 2003 acknowledged, that fathers will alienate in equal percentages to mothers when given the opportunity. It's just that they don't have the opportunity as frequently because most often, it's changing, but most often the mother has residential custody and therefore the opportunity. But in percentage-wise, it's an equal phenomenon.
I remember reading in your amicus brief, and I think you stated in your book as well, but you advise that you do not give the child the ability to make the choice between one parent.
That's right. That's
Why?
right. How do you put a child in that position? Which arm should I cut off, the right arm or the left arm? I mean, do you ask a child, do you say to a child, well, you know, what is your thinking about attending school today? Or, you know, do you think you should get that meningitis shot because your life is in danger? I'll give you the option. Well, there's certain things that are left to the parental authority. So that when the alienating parent says, oh, I don't do anything to interfere with the relationship between my child and the other parent, well, that's not good enough. Parenting is proactive. You have to take an active stance in getting the child to do what you want them to do. Attending school, attending medical appointments, having a relationship with the other parent. Children shouldn't get to decide that.
Well, you bring up the fact that that children under 18 aren't allowed to be on jury duty.
Sit on juries. There's a reason for that.
Right.
And I still submit that if you were standing trial for something and every one of your jurors was only 18 years old, how comfortable would you feel?
Not too good.
So, 18 is the minimum age to make decisions, but do we really have wisdom at 18?
No.
A child can't theorize what it's like to have a parent absent from their life. They don't have that abstract ability. The ability to think abstractly doesn't begin until the age of 13. It doesn't mature until at least 18 or later. So why are we asking children, do you want a parent in your life? They don't know it's in their own best interest. These cases are supposed to be decided on the basis of what's in the child's best interest. Children do not have the cognitive facility to know what's in their best interest. They would have chocolate candy for dinner.
Right.
They would spend their day playing video games and forget about school.
Now, what is the name of your book, by the way?
It's called The Parental Alienation Syndrome, a Family Therapy and Collaborative Systems Approach to Amelioration.
And it can be
You can
found
get it on Amazon. Amazon is the best way to get it.
And you have a website?
I have a website, parentalalienation.com. Everything on there is free and can be downloaded for free. It's something that a service I offer. All my amicus briefs are there. I don't charge to sign the amicus briefs. I wait till a few accumulate. I take them to my bank, which does notarize for free. I just ask that people submit an adequately stamped self-addressed return envelope. They must be filed in support of some other petition of redress of parental rights. They can't stand alone. It supports a petition in custody and visitation cases. There are also a number of articles that I've written there, how to document that this family dynamic exists. Research that 50-50 physical custody is in a child's best interest. There's a wealth of information there. All can be downloaded for free.
So you're doing this for free. Why?
Because I want children. I care about children. I am a victim of parental alienation myself. I know the effects and what I've had to do to recover from it. And I am hoping that other children will be spared going through this.
Have you had any success with these amicus briefs? Have they been effective in the courts? Do you know any of the results?
It's a recent service that I've offered, and you know how these cases drag on for years.
Right.
A number of them have been accepted by the court, which is good because they're being entertained. A few, the judges, when they don't want to hear anything, they will say, I'm not accepting something from someone who's not in person. So that I have had feedback that people are listening. In one situation, I recently testified on an Alabama case. I did a deposition, and the lawyer for the child was in favor of the alienating parent. When it came to have the deposition admitted into evidence, the lawyer for the child did not object to the evidence, to my deposition being admitted. I take that as a positive sign that maybe she was influenced. Of course, the attorney for the alienating parent objected. So it's hard to say. It's also hard to say what goes into all the criteria for judges' decisions. But I've been contacted by lawyers all over the country now. So if lawyers are making that decision that they're helpful, I would think that they must be.
You put it in a couple of quotes from the Bar Association, also from some of their findings as well. I was trying to scramble through and try to find it. Something about the Bar Association recognizing that this parental alienation is abuse.
Well, the American Bar Association was the publisher of a book called Children Held Hostage by Clower and Rivlin.
Yes.
And they followed, I think it was 700 children or families over a 12-year period. And they themselves concluded that some degree of alienation exists in 80% of all cases. And the problem is that it is a progressive syndrome like alcoholism. So the earlier you intervene, the better. But with the legal system the way it is, these cases drag on forever. I've seen cases start out with virtually no alienation, and by the time it was adjudicated, ended up in severe alienation. And it's really a travesty and so unnecessary. I mean, if every lawyer and every judge just asked themselves one simple question: how hard would it be for me to reject one of my parents? We all know the answer to that. You don't need to be a therapist. A prudent person's perception would say very hard, if not impossible. So why doesn't the red SOS go off for these judges when they hear it? Oh, she doesn't want to see her parent. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me.
Right.
And yet these cases just drag on. They need to treat these cases according to a legal principle called time is of the essence. It is so crucial because we're sitting in judgment of children's lives.
Right. And their lifelong decisions that affect them for the rest of their lives.
That's right.
Linda, I think we're running out of time. How can people get in touch with you again?
Okay, my email address is lmft@verizon.net. All that contact information is on my website. So I'm happy to.
And you're on Facebook too.
I'm on Facebook, Linda Case, Kase Gottlieb. So anyone who befriends me there, they can be in touch with me there too. I have a secret support group, which they can get admission into once they document that they're really a victim of alienation. That group has over 1,100 members, and some are extremely active, and there are a lot of success stories of reunification on there and a lot of coaching from one alienated parent to another. It's really been a great support group. So they can be added that way.
Linda, I really appreciate you coming on the show. Can we ask you to come back at another time?
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And
Okay.
thank you for watching Speak Up, and we hope that this information has been very helpful to you. Check her out on Facebook, and if you want to, look at this document, she's got a laundry list of credentials, and I highly recommend it. If you need help, give her a call. And we want to thank the Center for Redress of Grievances, LLC, for sponsoring this show. Until next week, thanks for watching Speak Up.
Every day, citizens around the country are faced with new dilemmas. Dilemmas that affect them profoundly. Whether it's injustice, discrimination, falling through the cracks, scandals and cronyism, balances of power, ethics, religious freedoms, state versus citizens, and unfunded mandates, and the list goes on and on and on. Welcome to Speak Up. It's directed at those who have fallen through the cracks, and it gives them a voice. It's your turn to speak up, to stand up and fight back.
The preceding program was provided by an independent producer solely responsible for its content. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent the views of this station, its staff, board of directors, or underwriters.